there is this, I was going to ask Mr. Shaukat Aziz whether there's a shift now in this focus towards the East.
السيدات والسادة الكرام، أهلا ومرحبا بكم في اليوم الأول من منتدى جدة الاقتصادي بدورته 12، والذي يأتي برعاية كريمة من لدن خادم الحرمين الشريفين الملك عبد الله بن عبد العزيز آل سعود حفظه الله. ويأتي المنتدى تحت شعار ما بعد الآفاق، اليوم نبني اقتصاد الغد، وذلك ليعزز مكانته كأكبر تجمع اقتصادي يتناول موضوعات وقضايا العالم، وذلك اقتصادياً بمشاركة 50 شخصية سعودية وعربية وعالمية ومتخصصة في الحقل السياسي والاقتصادي. تشرفنا ليلة البارحة في حفل الافتتاح بحضور العديد من الأعيان المحليين والعالميين في المجال السياسي والاقتصادي، ونكرر شكرنا للرعاة الذين تم تكريمهم يوم الأمس، وننوه إلى أنكم بإمكانكم التسجيل على الفيسبوك.com/JeddaChamber وtwitter.com/Jeddah_Chamber. وحتى لا أطيل عليكم سنبدأ الآن الجلسة الأولى بعنوان وما بعد التكتلات، تجربة دول الناشئة، السعي إلى تحقيق النمو الاقتصادي في عصر الدين، ويديرها السيد ريز خان مراسل قناة CNN سابقاً والمحاور المعروف. رحبوا معي بمدير الجلسة والمتحدثين.
Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to be your moderator for the first full day of the Jeddah Economic Forum, where we look at the theme of Beyond Borders. A couple of quick things as we get started here, please. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. There are translation headsets, of course, and if you need those, please do grab those from the back of the room. Also, if you could make sure that your mobile phones are switched to the off position, that would be an extreme help as well. Thank you. We have 3 sessions today looking at a particular theme here. We're starting off with a look at Beyond BRICs, seeking economic growth in an era of debt. Then we're going to examine building blocks, a global refocus on models of regional cooperation. Then finally, the 3rd session will tie it all together with a look at GCC consolidation, analyzing the economics of greater GCC integration. Now, as you can see, it's going to be a very interesting and comprehensive look at the economics of the region through what's happening what has happened in the past, what is taking place right now, and also what might be possible in the future. Either way, of course, the world economy has been taking quite a hit, as you know, and everyone's having to rethink about finances nowadays. Thank you very much. So, of course, it reminds me of a story of a young boy here in Jeddah who was in his class with his teacher. And the teacher said to him, if you had 10 riyals and you asked your father for 10 riyals, how much would you have? The young boy thought about it and said, 10 riyals. And the teacher said, you don't know your mathematics. And the young boy said, you don't know my father. Now, of course, times may be tough, but I hope that we'll have clarity of thought like that young boy. We know sometimes we get mixed messages around the world. I always like to remind people of a story of, that was told by John Major, the former British Prime Minister, who said that he had the former Russian President Boris Yeltsin over for dinner. And he said, I thought I would test him. So I asked Boris Yeltsin, if you could describe the economy of Russia in one word, what would you say? And Boris Yeltsin said, good. So John Major said, I asked him, how can you say good? Russia's falling apart, isn't it? All right, if you could use more than one word, what would you say? And Yeltsin said, not good. So I hope we have a little more clarity of thought than those mixed messages. Now, hopefully, as you'll hear from our distinguished panelists today, it'll be a far more interactive discussion than perhaps many of you are used to. In the interest of flow, I'm going to introduce them briefly, but I won't read out long biographies. You'll find in the forum's guidebook all the full details on our panelists. I've asked them also to avoid making speeches in order to be able to keep this a very interactive and dynamic session, because we want you to take part with your questions and comments as well. So let me introduce them, first of all. To my immediate right, we have Mr. Jose Fernandez, who's the US Assistant Secretary of State for Economic, Energy and Business Affairs, with a responsibility for overseeing all aspects of international trade and finance. Next to him, His Excellency Shaukat Aziz is the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, but is also very well known as a key figure in the international banking sector. Professor Anil Gupta is the Chief Advisor at the China-India Institute and a respected author on emerging markets. And Dr. Mohammad Al-Sabban is Senior Economic Advisor to the Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He's also recognized as a regular speaker on these matters at global events. I welcome you all, gentlemen. Thank you. I'm very honored to be with you. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to steer clear of speeches, but I want to kick off with a question to each of them to try to get their perspective on this issue of beyond BRICs and the idea of achieving some kind of growth in a time of economic stress. So perhaps if I could start with you, Mr. Fernandez. Much of the time, the eyes are turned towards the United States markets to see what direction the global economy is taking. Now, give us an idea of where things stand right now. And in an election year, of course, a lot of promises are being made. And I wonder, many of these will affect the rest of the world. Give me an idea on how you see the global trend taking place right now.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Things in the United States, we believe, have turned the corner. We lost 8 million jobs in the United States, basically before the recovery started. 4 million before the Obama administration got into office, and 4 million before our policies started taking shape. In the last 2 years, we've created about 3.5 million jobs. That means that we still haven't made up the losses in employment, but we're getting better. And if you look at the trends, if you look at inventories, starting to be built up. If you look at the GDP, it's growing not at the rate that you'd be used to here, but it's 2 to 3% in the United States. Actually starts to look better. So we believe that we've turned the corner. We've got a lot of work to do. There are obviously a number of things on the horizon that worry us, one of them being what's going on in Europe and obviously other trends in this part of the world. But I think we've got reason to be more optimistic, certainly, than we were a year ago. And hopefully that will continue.
So thank you. I'm going to follow up on some of those ideas you say about the optimism that's taking place. Now, perhaps Professor Gupta, if I could get to you and ask, well, actually, perhaps Mr. Shaukat Aziz, I can ask you really what shift you're seeing in the global economy from west to east. Is there really that happening?
Yes, first of all, this is a global economy, and globalization has resulted in more integration in the global economy. Having said that, so you can't work in isolation. This concept of decoupling, which you hear about, in my view, does not exist, because there's a lot of integration in terms of investment flows and trade flows across the world. Having said that, the mature economies, with due respect to everybody from mature economies, have not handled themselves as well as they should. Having said, also, the emerging economies are showing more growth, which they have to. The reason being that in a mature economy, you don't have the same drivers of growth as you do in a developing country. So the growth rates, as you look at the global economy, you will see much higher growth rates in emerging economies than you do in mature economies. If you look at mature economies today, the United States, the Honorable Assistant Secretary just described what has happened. There are still a lot of challenges there. And I think, if I may be a bit presumptive, I would say that one of the reasons the US economy and the European economy ran into challenges is lack of structural reform. Normally, when you talk of structural reform, you talk about developing countries or emerging countries only. But now, events have shown us that if you stay still and don't reform, don't change, don't adapt, to new ways and new challenges, even a mature economy can get in trouble. The US is trying to improve its growth rate, and I'm sure they'll do it. But the point is, this could have been avoided. Second thing in mature economies is Europe. I think what we saw in Europe in terms of the current crisis, which is far from over, will tell us that how not to do things. Now, they are trying to get their act together, and we hope they do. But the fact is that the lack of cohesion in European economic thinking and policy has led to situations which we face today. I'm hoping that with the latest fiscal compact, which they signed 2-3 days ago, this will be another way of hopefully addressing the situation. But what we have now learned through this crisis, and then I'll move to emerging countries, in developed countries is that unless you create jobs, unless you get growth, you will have political problems and you will have economic problems. On the emerging market side, clearly we see certain countries marching ahead because one, the economics of emerging markets is very different. There's a lot of room to grow. They have to invest, they have to reform, and they have to get investments from local investors and much more from overseas investors. No country in the world can grow without investment coming from everywhere. Last point is that in emerging markets, the other thing the emerging countries have to worry about is governance and reform. There it's uneven across the world, and clearly one country stands out in emerging markets. The BRICs do, but within BRICs, China is a real driver for growth, although things have slightly slowed. The biggest challenge I see in the short run for emerging markets is cost of energy. If oil price remains where it is, you will see a couple of percentage basis points off the growth. And that is something which is very relevant to where we are today.
Thank you, sir. Well, you led me on to a perfect segue to Professor Anil Gupta. I was going to touch on this issue with you because, of course, you've written extensively about this, and you heard Mr. Aziz saying here about the various factors he feels affect both the emerging and the developed markets. And I wonder, when you look at the situation, what we're looking at here is, looking beyond the BRICs for economic growth. Is that possible, the way the world is shaped right now?
Yes, I think so, Riz, because if you look at just from over the last 10, 12 years, how the world economy is changing and where it's headed, that in 2000, which is not that far back, emerging economies were only about 17, 18% of the world's GDP. Today, they're about 33, 35% of world GDP. And in fact, if you just assume emerging economies continue to grow around 5%, 5 to 6%, which is extremely likely, by 2025, emerging economies will be more than 50% of the world's GDP. So essentially, this rebalancing, and I agree with Mr. Aziz about that it's not decoupling really, but it's rebalancing of the global economy that's going on. Another thing I would like to add is that in addition to this rebalancing, the world economy is getting increasingly interconnected. And this kind of an interconnection is actually both good, phenomenally good, but at the same time it comes with some risks. So I'd just like to touch briefly on that. If we look at, in terms of, if you look at the main theme of this conference, which is really beyond borders, which is about interlinkages. That interlinkages, be they bilateral, be they regional, be they global, those interlinkages give access to bigger markets, to lower cost resources, to technology, to capital, to talent, to ideas, and of course to competition. And that's good because that gets the innovation flowing. So all of that is very good. And that's been going on, and it's quite likely, while there may be some hiccups here and there, this process of integration is basically irreversible. But at the same time, what are the risks? And I see two risks at two levels from the integration. So one is what I would say systemic risks or catastrophic risks. That really comes from, in fact, academic studies on complexity theory. That when a system becomes more complex, which means it becomes more interconnected, essentially the likelihood of catastrophic failures go up because any major perturbation in one corner of the system can bring the whole system down. So, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, it's a good example of how, the risks of catastrophic failure do go up. Hopefully that doesn't happen too often, but that's something we have to guard against. And number two is what I would say, in an interlinked world economy, risks at the level of individual nodes. Because if you think of the world economy as a network, so we have the nodes and the linkages. So what happens is that the catastrophic risks come from the linkages. But at the level of individual nodes is that nodes, two types of risks I would identify. Number one, nodes which are weak in an interlinked global economy may not necessarily benefit from the interlinkages, or let's put it this way, the negatives may outweigh. And a good example of that would be Mexico. So yes, obviously, NAFTA, that interconnection is fantastic for, was very good for Mexico. But at the same time, we have global interlinkages taking place, and Mexico suffered on the manufacturing front vis-a-vis China. And so if a node is weak, global interlinkages may not necessarily be good for that particular node. So that's, you have to watch out for. And finally, the other kind of is that if a node just chooses not to behave by the rules of the network, And I think Greece is a good example of a node, if you will, in the European network that was both weak and chose not to behave by the rules of the network, And so those would be some observations about the pluses that come from interlinkages and the risks that come with it.
Thank you, sir. Some excellent points raised here, which I hope we can get your input into in just a few moments. But first, let me bring in also Dr. Mohammad Al-Sabban, and sir, get your perspective on this issue, on the need to focus on emerging markets and the impact, particularly for the GCC and I guess also for Saudi Arabia in particular.
Well, thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Thank you, Riz. I think Saudi Arabia is watching very closely what is happening on the international scene. We are equally worried with regard to the situation in the European Union, the United States, and most of the OECD countries. And we feel that the emerging economies are the bright spot, if I can say that, while the EU is going to go back into recession this year. It will not start recovery before the end of this year. The United States is going to grow by 1.8% this year, and that is, according to the US standard, still very weak. We see that the emerging economies are going to grow by 5.4%. And this is above the international or world economy average, growth rate. So I think the emerging economies this time, they are pulling the rest of the world and not vice versa. Usually the developed countries who are, in the case of recession, that they are pulling other countries in order to revive the world economy. And I think their impact now is very tremendous. We see that we used to have the G8 meeting regularly, etc., but they found that it is irrelevant without including the emerging economies. And we see that we have created the G20, where Saudi Arabia, among others, are members of the G20. And we see their impact on the economy, the world economy. Secondly, I think with regard to GCC and Saudi Arabia, we have watched that the oil demand for oil in OECD countries has already peaked in 2008 and now start to decline. While in the emerging economies, we see the continuous increase in the demand for oil. As a matter of fact, the demand for oil decreased by 2 million barrels per day in 2008, 2011 in OECD countries, while in China alone, increased by 2 million in the same period. So we are watching very closely. We are an oil exporter country, and we think that the promising market for Saudi Arabia in the coming period will be China, India, and other emerging economies. And because of the policies and measures that has been adopted by OECD countries, we see that their demand for oil is declining and will continue to decline.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sabban. And actually, perhaps I could get a response, Mr. Fernandez, on this idea we've been hearing about with the emerging markets, the emerging economies. Do you believe the BRIC markets and those that are sort of following in their wake can actually sustain that level of growth?
I think I'm very optimistic. I'm very bullish on the prospects for the emerging markets. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers out there, the IMF is predicting that you're going to have in the emerging markets as much as 7% growth till the year 2015. Obviously, China is talking about 8% growth as a soft landing. I do think, however, that you've got some challenges in this part of the world, and actually it's also an opportunity, but you're looking at the problem or something that could either be a demographic dividend or a demographic bulge, which is the young people. The fact that the population in this part of the world, for example, is increasing at 3% annually. Those people are going to need jobs, and if you look at what the Asian economies did, is they were able to incorporate those people into the economy. The question of infrastructure. Every country, every emerging country has huge infrastructure plans, starting with India, which amazes me. They're planning to build as much as $1 trillion worth of infrastructure in the next 5 years. The issue of the private sector and fostering private sector growth is yet another challenge. It's also an opportunity, but you have a number of economies that have been, to a large extent, state-led. You also have a number of economies where the local population works in the public sector and the foreign population works in the private sector, and yet you are going to need, in order to create the kinds of jobs and the number of jobs to sustain growth, you're going to need to increase private sector growth in a part of the world that perhaps has been more focused on public sector employment. So these are challenges. They're also opportunities. But I think overall, I'm very optimistic. I think the combination of natural resources, the young people who want to get into the economy, the enthusiasm, the optimism that I've seen as I travel around the Middle East and North Africa region is something that, if properly harnessed, I believe will yield dividends.
Thank you very much, Said. Well, let's see if we can get your participation, because, of course, this forum is about dialogue and discussion. It would be great to hear any of your questions and comments regarding the issues that have been raised. Thank you very much, sir. Put your hands up, and I will get the microphone to you as soon as possible. If we have the microphones on the floor, we'll try and get them over to you. One gentleman there, and I see another one over there. So I'll come to you, and you, sir, as well. Thank you, gentlemen. I'll come to you in just a second. I'll try and get to the hands in the order in which I see them go up. Let's see if we have the microphones on the floor. Anywhere? If we have them. Right, we're just getting them out to you now. So as we do that, as we get the microphones, and I will get to you in just a second, let me follow up with Mr. Shaukat Aziz on the issue of Europe, because that was raised. And I wonder, considering the state Europe's in, at a time when the US obviously has its challenges too, how easy do you believe it will be for the BRIC countries to maintain their growth trajectories?
Because of what's happening in Europe?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think clearly the slowdown in Europe has affected and will affect the rest of the world. But Europe has to, we must appreciate why Europe ended up where it did. There's a lesson to be learned by everybody. When you get economic union in a group of countries, you cannot just have monetary union without fiscal coordination and fiscal interaction. I wouldn't call it fiscal union because they are separate budgets, etc. That was the biggest flaw in the European setup. The other thing is that when you have economic union, you cede sovereignty. A nation gives up sovereignty to a multilateral body. That's a very difficult political decision for a country. So will you allow your budget deficit to be dictated by somebody in Brussels or your own capital? These are real issues which are now coming on the forefront. So there is some food for thought. And I think this thought is going into various capitals. The fiscal compact, which I talked about, which was agreed by the European heads of state 3 days ago, is a step in that direction. But let me say that unless you really give up part of your sovereignty to a regional body, you will have these pains going on. So the problem is not over, but it's much better than where it ought to be. Now, the impact on BRICS is Europe is a big supplier of investment money, to the emerging world. Europe also raises a lot of debt for the emerging world. Both of these are affected. And as I said earlier, for any economy to grow, they need to attract investments. They cannot grow only on domestic investments. Be it China, be it India, be it any country in the world, you need to attract investment. So these engines of investment providers are a bit soft at the moment, United States included. So as they get healthier, the outlook will be better. Plus, lastly, as I said, the emerging markets countries must reform, must change, must improve their infrastructure, their transparency, their governance, because there's talk of corruption in many countries. And the way you fight corruption is to be transparent. And how do you become transparent? Through reforms. You put it out in the open, you will see the corruption going down. So anyway, these are some of the challenges which the emerging markets do face.
Dr. Sabban, a quick thought before we get to our panelists.
Just to comment on this point, I was, probably all of us, very surprised to see delegates from the European Union going back and forth to China and others in order to get some money. That is really strange, I mean, compared to the past where it was vice versa. And now we see that they are going to Saudi Arabia, they are going to China and others. Please give us some money in order to bail out some of the ailing economies in the European Union. So this is basically just what I wanted to add to Mr. Shaukat Aziz.
Thank you for your comments, sir. I will try and get, if the runners with the microphones, you can keep an eye on me and I'll tell you which hands go up first so we can make sure we get them in order. I think the gentleman already has the microphone there.
Yes.
But
Good morning. Whenever we have discussions about growth and about debts, all the time we talk about oil and its impact. Now, I never heard anybody of our good speakers, or rarely we find it in the European American literature. What is the impact of all the taxes that's imposed on the import of oil on the consumers in those countries, and how much it really affects development and growth? Our major problem last week in England, they have increased the tax on oil 60%. They are making more money than Saudi Arabia out of oil. And they all look for Saudi Arabia to be the survivor. Thank you.
thank you. Perhaps, Mr. Fernandez, you could start on that first, and then I'll come to Dr. Sabban. I want to get your perspective on this.
Thank you. I knew there was a disadvantage in being the first one on this side. I guess the one thing I would say is the oil-producing countries are not having problems finding markets despite the taxes. If you look at the supply, there's plenty of supply, but it's not, the world is not awash in extra oil. So I would argue that if you look at at least what we've been trying to do in the U.S., where for the most part, petroleum taxes, gas taxes are state and not federal. One of the things that we have been doing is trying to foster alternative sources of energy and renewable energy. And if you look at what we've been able to do in the last few years, we're producing 700,000 barrels a day more than we were a few years ago. 15% more natural gas, shale gas is a critical piece of the American energy picture today. And there's a lot of emphasis, despite some setbacks, there's a lot of emphasis on solar energy, things of that nature that could also bring us technology that could be applied here. So I would say taxes exist, but I think The challenge is trying to use those taxes to develop alternative sources of energy so that we have a wide spectrum of potential energy resources.
Dr. Sabban, I know a lot of it was directed towards the situation for Saudi Arabia.
Well, let me just start by remembering what Mr. Al-Naimi, my minister, said one time to a European colleague, a European minister. He said, we will sell you our oil for free. Just give us the taxes that you are collecting. And of course, nobody. As a matter of fact, the amount of taxes reach about 60% of the final composite barrel prices. And that is very huge. And it has a lot of impact, especially when you are still subsidizing coal in many European countries, and also subsidizing other energy sources, including nuclear. And that will affect the relative prices and definitely will have huge impact, as been said by Dr. Al-Zamil, huge impact on the demand for oil. And when I started, I said that because of the policies and measures being adopted by OECD countries, we see that demand start to decline, has peaked in 2008 and now start to decline. And that is very serious. It is not only the taxes, but also there are the other measures, the CAFE standard, the different measures that has been taken, a huge billions of dollars that have been put in form of subsidies to the other energy sources. So in brief, I think the impact of taxes is very huge and start to affect the demand for oil. And the only promising area where we can rely on is the emerging economy.
Dr. Gupta, you wanted to add a comment as well. Sorry.
Just wanted to add the, that, and of course, oil trade is, part of broader international trade. And, if you look at what impact does international trade have on individual economies, clearly the impact is important, but at the same time, it's possible to, let's say, overstate the importance. So just, to look at some numbers. If you look at, say, Malaysia versus Pakistan, and so Malaysia obviously is an oil exporter and runs a huge trade surplus. In fact, the figures I have for 2009, 2010 is about 22%, their trade surplus is 22% of GDP. On the other hand, Pakistan is a oil importer and runs a significant trade deficit. But then if you look at, last 10 years, the GDP growth rate in Malaysia is 5.0, in Pakistan is 5.1. If you look, on the other hand, China versus India. China, of course, is not an oil exporter, but it is a significant, it runs a trade surplus, about plus 4% of GDP. India, on the other hand, runs a trade deficit. Again, largely due to energy, a trade deficit about minus 4% of GDP. But then if you look at China's growth rate last 10 years, about 10%. India's growth rate last 10 years, about 8%, and so on. So I think that there is a risk that people overstate the importance of oil exports or imports on a particular country's GDP.
Mr. Aziz, sorry.
Quick comment. I think the truth is somewhere in between. The fact is, having made many budgets in my earlier days as finance minister, one of the easiest revenue source is putting or increasing the tax on oil because it is the easiest tax to collect. This is the honest truth. It has nothing to do with oil as such. But when you're sitting there making your budget, you need something which you can collect, and you can collect at the sale point. Oil is one of the few items. This is the practical reality, number one. Number two, also some of the tax, when oil prices rise, very few countries pass the whole, I'm talking about the developing countries, not the developed countries. The capacity to absorb that high price is limited in developing countries. So what happens is, certainly in my country, when I was running the affairs there, we did not pass on everything. Because if you passed on everything, it would be unaffordable. The income levels are very low. So the truth is somewhere in between. The fact is, every country looks to oil as a revenue contribution to the budget. In many of our countries, like ours, it's one of the biggest items. But when the price goes up, you have to subsidize. And if you pass on everything, you get public reaction. I give you one example, Nigeria. A few weeks ago, you see what happened there. And everybody, they are an oil producer, but they tried to balance it a little bit. They didn't even get close, and there were the problems in the streets. So you have to take these practical realities. In fact, the rise in oil prices today cannot be blamed on OPEC. You know, OPEC has been a very responsible, in my view, a group of countries or suppliers. I'm not saying it because we are sitting in an OPEC country, but the fact is they are fairly responsible. But when you have geopolitical events and the prices go above, that's a problem. The last point is, which we don't talk about, but I think is a cause for concern, is the high level of speculative activity in commodities. That's what gets the price up. And the producer may benefit, but in the long run, it hurts the producer too, because you just affect the overall demand of your product. So paper-based speculation on commodities needs more reform, more governance at the global level. And frankly, we haven't done much about it.
Well, I'm glad my flight here was booked before March the 1st, because apparently I just missed another fuel surcharge. So, sorry, Dr. Sabban.
Just very briefly to add to what His Excellency Mr. Aziz, I think what he said with regard to developing countries is absolutely right. There are some policies that you need to adapt in order to not to show the public the impact of higher oil prices. But when you call for a carbon tax, for example, and then it ends up to be a gasoline tax, then it is not a carbon tax. And when you say that I'm implying or imposing this carbon tax in order to reduce dependency on imported oil, then this is a political issue and the rhetoric that will not be helpful.
Thank you, sir. Now I'm going to try and get as many questions in. Please, by the way, if you have the microphones, gentlemen, keep an eye on me so that I can tell which hands have gone up first, so we can get them, because I know this gentleman had his hand up early on.
Thank you, Riz. Thank you for your guests on the podium. My name is Mutashar Murshid, Saudi banker. The impression one gets here is that we have two blocks. One block is the advanced economies, and the other block is the emerging markets or emerging countries. You have troubles and difficulties in the advanced economies, and you have 5% or in that boundaries of growth in the emerging markets. In my own opinion, I think this is something that we need to look at very carefully, because leaving aside the integration between the global economies and the interlinkages as Professor Gupta described, you tend to find a deeper issue, which is the structural issues that we have. Take, for example, the difference now between the US and Europe. We see very serious steps are being taken in Europe to have a structural reform in place, hence Spain and Greece. And whereas in the US, you still have printing of the dollar, and you have a huge debt, and also no serious steps been taken structurally to find jobs, and vice versa. Your comments, please. Thank you.
Okay. Perhaps first I could start with Mr. Fernandez on this issue of the US printing money and not doing anything to seriously address the jobs situation. And then perhaps after that, Professor, we can get a response as well.
You know, I would, certainly on the jobs front, I would disagree strongly. We have, for the last 2 years, our main concern in government has been to increase jobs. There's not a day that we're not reminded that priority number 1, 2, and 3 are to create more American jobs. And if you look at what we've been trying to do in terms of the National Export Initiative, which is to double exports in 5 years in order to create 2 million new jobs, what we've been trying to do to increase foreign direct investment into the U.S., that's also to create jobs. And if you look at the numbers, as I mentioned earlier, for the last 2 years, it hasn't been a torrent of jobs, but it has been an increasing trickle of jobs, and we are making headway. So I would disagree with the statement that we're not putting enough attention on jobs. In fact, that, as I said, that's priority number 1, 2, and 3. On the debt, if you look at the debate that we had last summer in Congress, that resulted in in a reduction in the budget. I think there's plenty of work to be done, but I do think that if you wanted to look at the bright side, I do think that we are certainly recognizing the issue, which is something that you didn't have several years ago. We realize that the budget is an issue we've got to deal with, and the result of the impasse last summer in Congress was that we are making substantial reductions in our budget deficit this year.
Professor Gupta, your response also.
Yeah. I would agree that saying the rich economies and the emerging economies, that's still a simplification, because there are huge differences among the rich economies and similarly among the developing economies. Just to pick up on Europe versus the US, I would be inclined to actually second Mr. Fernandez's perspective, because just look at two numbers, for example, that Europe is running at about 1% growth rate, and they're lucky if they continue to do that in the 1.5%. US, you're looking at more like 2.5%. If you look at external debt to GDP ratio, recent figures, US is running about 101% external debt to GDP. Look at Germany, 220%. Look at France, 437%. UK at 131. Etc. So, I mean, the numbers in terms of external debt, the US numbers are not very good, but European numbers actually are even worse. So I think, and similarly, among emerging economies, if you look at two of the big ones, China and India, very different. China is facing challenges, but the challenges are that far too much investment in infrastructure, and so what do they do now? You can't build a second highway and second rail track, between Beijing and Shanghai. India runs a different kind of. India has too little infrastructure. So I would agree there are indeed differences, between the two groups or inside the two groups themselves.
Thank you very much, sir. Now, gentlemen, I promise you I'm trying to get to the hands in the order in which they went up. That's why it's important that the runners with the microphones keep an eye on me. This gentleman had his hand up very early. Number 2, microphone. Thank you. I'll come to you in just a moment.
Good morning. Saudi Arabia is now right in the center of the string, okay, pulling east, pulling west. But we have seen in the last 10 years a huge development with regard to the relationship of Saudi Arabia, China. But I think we in Saudi Arabia, we did not use the package deal system that the Chinese apply to benefit particularly the private sector and the manufacturing sector in Saudi Arabia. And if we see now for the coming 25 years, a lot of synergy is really needed between Saudi Arabia, India, China, in order for Saudi Arabia not to be just only on the energy sector or the relationship to be only between state-owned companies. What advice you give to Saudi Arabia as a country and to the Saudi business group in this regard?
Thank you for your question. So I'm going to get two perspectives here, Dr. Sabban and then Mr. Aziz as well.
Well, thank you for the question. I think you are absolutely right. Saudi Arabia is still heavily dependent on exportation of crude oil. We have embarked on diversifying our economy, but it will take a little bit longer. But there are serious efforts being undertaken, and I think we all notice that in the infrastructure, in the industry, and etc. You name it. And we are better using our financial capability this time than the last time in the first boom. So I think, of course, you cannot compare us with the China or other emerging economies. Of course, we will try to be on the same level of economic growth, definitely. China, as we all know, is getting or achieving 10% annual growth for the last 30 years. That's tremendous. Saudi Arabia is dependent on the level of oil production and also oil prices, but we are in the range between 5 and 6% annually, and this is a good growth rate. So I think one thing that we need to do is to do our homework, try to, as you rightly said, try to give more leading role to the private sector in order to lead the economic development, lead the economic diversification on one hand, and also in the international level, we need to have to conclude, and I hope that Mr. Al-Uwaishik is here, that GCC need to conclude the free trade agreements with the emerging economies. That will be hugely beneficial to Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries. And it is not only with China, should include Indonesia, Turkey, etc. So I think closer cooperation with emerging economies, doing better homework in Saudi Arabia and other GCC, and try to have a very clear vision. I think we have an excellent leadership in Saudi Arabia that we need all to cooperate in order to implement and achieve the economic diversification that we are thinking of.
Thank you very much. And of course, as someone who's had to balance the books, there is that difficulty in balancing growth and overheating, isn't there, Mr. Aziz?
Yeah, thank you. I think the question was what Saudi Arabia could do. I've worked in most parts of the world. I think the Saudi private sector is second to none, meaning it's as good as wherever you get in the world. So first of all, you have the human capital. Secondly, all countries must be focusing first on their competitive and comparative advantage. You can't produce everything. You don't want to produce everything. So, number one, your biggest advantage is energy. So anything related to energy, petrochemicals, upstream, downstream, a lot is happening, but a lot more can be done in the private sector. And down to very ancillary products, which can be, you could be the global supplier of some really important petrochemical downstream products. You are today a supplier, but you're not the dominant supplier. So I think there's a natural advantage there. Secondly, I think you have domestic market which is growing, the population is growing. The demographics of Saudi Arabia look much more attractive today than they did 20 years ago. Population growth, younger population. And education levels are very, very high, or are getting better. So that will create a market for share of mind business, say technology, software development, etc. Why can't there be more software development? There's nothing stopping you. So I think that will emerge gradually with time. The human capital is good. The third thing is location. If you look at Saudi Arabia's location, it is really very pivotal. So you could be a big logistics hub. You could be a bigger airline hub than you are today. And I think there's a lot of infrastructure being developed. So shipping, airlines, movement of goods, you cover both sides. You have the Red Sea, you have the Gulf, you have all these advantages, and you yourself have a big market. Today, some other countries may be benefiting from this big market on logistics, but I think you can take that over. And I think if you keep on this path, you will focus on things you do better, and you have a natural advantage. But don't try to do, no country can do everything. And even China is today a big importer, as it is a big exporter. All their raw materials, they are very, obviously, to some extent vulnerable. If the global raw material supply dries up or the prices go up, it affects their manufacturing capability. So I think we must focus always, not do everything for which we need. And then what we do, we should excel and be a top world-class player. If that's the strategy, the rest can all be tactics, of course, can be.
Professor, I'm going to ask you to weave your thought into the next answer because I need to get a few more questions in from the audience. Young men with the microphone, please wait to get an indication from me. Don't give the microphone to anyone without me because a lot of people have their hands up and haven't had a chance yet. So, and I know you, sir, I'll come to you. Gentlemen there, please, and I'll come to the ladies in just a moment. Tell us who you are as well, sir, so we know.
Thank you and congratulations for the organizers. I have 3 points. First one, to the organizers. I think we have to overcome the problem of having the Arabic language, the main language of the conference. But that is an organizational point of view, but I want to direct this to the organizers to take care of that in future. So, this is one. The second one...
So you can speak in Arabic if you like, by the way. We have translation.
Fine. The second issue to go back to the taxation and the environment. Presently, there is a big crisis between Europe and the rest of the world as far as the emission, the taxation and emission, and the Europeans are insistent that air transport, planes that goes to Europe must comply with certain aspect of environmental restrictions.
That's true.
Dr. Sabban, of course, has been following this on behalf of Saudi Arabia and mainly Aramco, but this issue has an economic implication, and it also has a political implication. This is one aspect that we would like to hear the views of the panelists. The third issue is we hear about Asia, Europe, North America. What is going on in Africa? Has Africa been written off as a potential development arena in the near future, or is this economic environment in Africa is immune from the world economic crisis? Thank you.
So thank you for those two very relevant points. Also, again, please, I emphasize, if you would like to speak in Arabic, we do have translation. It's important that we recognize that there is meant to be no dominance in the language here. It's meant to be equally balanced. And please do feel free to speak in Arabic if you need to. Perhaps, Mr. Fernandez, I could start with that first. Are the emissions regulations perhaps a bit too tough, as the gentleman has indicated? And perhaps you might want to address Africa too. Otherwise, Professor, I'll get to you too.
Yeah, on the emissions trading scheme, which is what the question refers to, the European Union announced a while back that they were going to impose a tax based on certain emissions. Our position, and this is a position that we have taken together with a number of other countries around the world, including India, Russia, many of the other BRICs, we agree with the general objective, which is to try and lower the emissions from air transport. However, our issue has been that this cannot be done unilaterally. This has to be done in a way that the international community can agree on a solution. We have made our concerns evident. We have been quite vocal in opposing them. We have here we're on the same side as China, as Saudi Arabia, as India, as Russia. We had recently a meeting where we in Moscow of 50-some countries that actually oppose this scheme. Again, we do not oppose the general objective of reducing emissions from air transport, but we do disagree with the way that it was imposed. And as an aside, I would say that today, U.S. airlines emit less carbon than they did 20 years ago, even though you have a lot more traffic. So we have done on the private level, without any kind of international agreement, our airlines have actually reduced their emissions. But I do think we have a looming problem. We've got to find a solution within the international community that will allow all of us to move forward with the EU ETS scheme. On Africa, I agree with you. I think Africa is the unspoken story in the emerging markets. If you look at some of the fastest growing economies in the world, the African tigers have gotten a lot of attention. I do think some of the same concerns that people voice with respect to the BRICs are also applicable to Africa. If you look at it at the issue of infrastructure, if you look at the issue of education, entrepreneurship, the need to create a private sector and to create the kinds of investments, regulations that you need to attract investment. And lastly, a point that is not talked about with respect to the BRICs very much, but I do think it's applicable in Africa, is the question of agriculture. Africa has the largest amount of arable, uncultivated land in the world. It also has by far the lowest yields. And so one of the things that you're going to have to deal with as you look at African growth is the issue of agriculture. And that brings us to the age-old question of biotechnology and what will be the role of biotechnology in agriculture in Africa. They are going to have to deal with their low yields and the issue of hunger before they can move very much further.
Professor Gupta, I'd said to you next, and I'll get comments from the others.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I mean, Mr. Fernandez, I'd second his point and just add to it, first, I think this is a golden period for Africa. The rise of Asia in particular is leading to a boom in the demand for resources. Africa is very rich in resources, so clearly that's what's behind the 5 to 6% growth rate in Africa. And the question for Africa really is that while this is fantastic as it is, that how do you then diversify the African economies or individual African economies and avoid the curse, if you will, the resource curse, because being resource dependent in a time of a booming demand for resources is very good, but at the same time it can have potential negative implications in the society. And so, how do you diversify and go up the value chain instead of being just a pure resource-driven economy?
A very quick thought, Dr. Sabban, and then Mr. Aziz after. Dr. Sabban first, please.
Just very briefly with regard to the issue of the aviation taxes by the EU. Among other things, I'm heading the Saudi delegation to the climate convention negotiations, and this is one of the very important issues that has been negotiated. We all said that there should be no unilateral action. And what the EU is taking is basically unilateral action. It is not under ICAO. It is not under climate agreement. It's not under any international system. So that is why it has been objected not only by the United States, but most of the countries, with the exceptions of the EU and its allies. And I think now the pressure is very huge on the EU in order to revise their position. And I think they will do that because the emerging economies, along with the US and others, are very strong and very adamant. And this will impact oil demand, of course. We all know that transportation sector is the main front remaining to the oil demand, and that will impact definitely. If all countries take measures such as aviation taxes, that will impact the demand for oil. But also, in addition to that, the developing countries will be impacted because price of tickets, airline tickets, will be higher as a result of such a system. Thank you.
Mr. Shaukat, is very quick.
Just a short word on Africa. I think Africa really today represents one of the most attractive opportunities for investors. I'm a little involved in it, so may I say the three sectors which is attracting a lot of attention there. One is infrastructure, so electricity, power generation, BOT, etc. You can set up IPPs, power producing companies there. Secondly, mining. Africa has always been a mining continent, but the monopolies are breaking. The good news is that now it's getting more market-based, so there's opportunity for investors here. Third, and equally important, if not more, is the agribusiness side. While the Assistant Secretary said the yields are low, and I think that's correct, but in corporate farming, you see a big investment flow into Africa could be the agriculture supplier to the world for many different commodities. One commodity I'll give you as an example, which is palm oil. You will see a time very soon where, unlike East Asia, which is today the biggest supplier of palm oil, it's going to change to Africa. And the palm oil trees went to East Asia from Africa. Cocoa trees went to East Asia from Africa. They are now coming back. So the agri potential is huge. And last point, the raising of money, private equity, funds, etc. for Africa has never been as high as it is today. Investor interest is there from all parts of the world.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to get a quick question from the ladies, and I'll come back to the gentlemen. Thank you for your patience. Microphone number 6.
Hi, my name is Tuba Tarekli, and I've been coming to JEF since the first year it was founded, and today I wanted to hear something different. We are talking about debt beyond borders, which I don't think we would have talked about 10 years ago. And I just want to ask the panel to kindly think a little bit different. And my question will go as follows. If you were to think different, meaning Saudi Arabia is not about energy, education, granted it is a must. And we've studied everything upstream and downstream. Aramco guys, God bless them, spend every living day and night they have in studying every drop of oil we have. I just want to ask you, if you were to look at Brazil, Russia, India, and China, what would be at a high corporate governance level a policy that have been introduced in those countries that was a wow to you, that you said, had we had this policy 10 years ago in our countries, we would never have been in this situation in the first place. So if you were to look at them, give us a lesson learned from those. Thank you.
Let me get two perspectives. First, Professor Gupta, your thoughts on this?
It's a very interesting question, but my answer may not be exactly what you're looking for. My answer is that I don't think there's any good lesson one could learn from any of the 4 BRIC countries. Because if I think in terms of governance, I think Russia, Brazil, China, India, all 4 countries suffer hugely from governance problems. So I don't think they're good role models in any way.
Mr. Fernandez, can you see any positives that, as the young lady suggested, that might be adopted?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know how applicable they might be to this part of the world, but I do see, if you look at Brazil, India as well, perhaps certainly China, perhaps less Russia. I think one lesson learned is the rise of the middle class. In Brazil, the government, you basically have, out of a population of 200 million people, the Lula government in 8 years brought about 30 to 40 million people out of poverty and into the middle class. Think of what that means in terms of consumption. Think of what that means in terms of creating a market. Think of what that means in order to create a state that will be able to collect taxes and therefore provide more services to its own population. All of these countries have created, even in Russia, you've had a middle class being created, and that's something that I think bears looking at. How applicable it is here, it's a question mark. The one point that I think you could take that might be applicable here is all of these countries, to one extent or another, have focused on the private sector, have focused on entrepreneurship, have looked at the question of how do you foster innovation, how do you fund the private sector, how do you make it easier for companies to fail and come back up and invest again. You don't put people in jail for bankruptcies. All of these issues are issues that I think in one way or shape or another can be useful here. But really the rise of the private sector and the rise of a middle class, which may be the two sides of the same coin, are lessons that I think might be applicable here.
Okay, Mr. Shaukat, this is a quick comment, then Dr.
Yes.
Sabban.
I think, ma'am, these 4 countries in BRICS you mentioned are very different. But just for purposes of answering your question, I think one of the streams which cuts through these, and frankly, there are many other countries who've done this better than the BRICS, is liberalization, deregulation, privatization. These are drivers for change and growth, and they unleash forces in a country which give rise to a lot of opportunity. Then it's up to the private sector to take it and run with it. Having said that, deregulation and liberalization does not mean abdication by the government. The government responsibility increases because accompanied with this has to be strong regulation in terms of regulatory oversight and policy oversight. So it's not contradictory. And that's where countries sometimes have failed. But there are better examples than BRICS, where countries have deregulated, unleashed the economy, released the forces of the private sector to go, and at the same time have good regulation to keep them within track and protect public interest. Government always has to protect public interest. You cannot leave it to markets alone, but you can do both at the same time.
Thank you, sir. And Dr. Sabban, a very quick thought.
Briefly, I think liberalization and deregulation are very important in this sense. However, I think there is a very fundamental issue that these countries have followed, and that is moving to a knowledge economy, where they concentrated on education in order to create a large group of the nationals who can invent, can create, can motivate the society. And that is what Saudi Arabia was missing. And now, because of the Al-Aghar Group strategy that had drawn in order to transfer Saudi Arabia into a knowledge economy, now Saudi Arabia is implementing this strategy in order to move to a knowledge economy or a knowledge society. And that, I think this is the key issue for Saudi Arabia in order to catch up and leapfrog with the others.
Professor, you had a rethink.
Beyond the BRICs, as I said, I don't see BRICs as particularly a good, model. But a country that I really, really admire in terms of moving up on the knowledge economy, and that is doing it very aggressively, is South Korea. Because South Korea, your per capita income is about $20,000 a year. That's similar to Saudi Arabia. But it is absolutely, it's moving ahead at a faster pace than China or Japan on the technology sector.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to just get a couple of questions in. Number 4, thank you for your patience. Then I'll come to number 3.
Thank you, Riz. Faisal Abbas, I'm a Saudi blogger with the Huffington Post. My question is for Mr. Aziz. Your Excellency, this is a question for you in both your capacity as a former Prime Minister and an established banker. And I'm sure a lot of us here know that you've contributed drastically to the Samba financial group in this country. I would like to ask you, since we're talking about developing countries and in the era, seeking development in the era of debt, about the situation in Pakistan, which, as you know, is a country we look at dearly in this country, which means a lot to us on a religious, economic, and various aspects as well. Unfortunately, a number of natural disasters, political situation, political problems which may have altered Pakistan's chances in acquiring loans in the future. For example, if you remember last year during the strike on Osama bin Laden, there's been some Western countries who were saying the ISI or the Pakistani government has been involved in harboring Osama bin Laden. I wanted to know what are your thoughts, or if you have any information regarding this, and how do you see Pakistan coming out of this situation in the next few years? Thank you.
Faisal, thank you. Before you answer, Mr. Aziz, I'm going to ask for question number 3 and get that so I can perhaps, if there's any segue, I can include.
Thank you. Thank you, Riz. This is Dr. Khalid Maimani, chairman of the HRM department at KAU. Saudi Arabia has a lot of wealth that went through it without gaining optimized benefits. And probably this is due to the cultural issues as well as other issues. Now, I'm wondering if in 30 years' time, our children will be at less advantage, and hence the future of the country in general is being hindered by such issues. Is there any formula that you would advise to help our society whereby we jump over these issues? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Well, first, let's start with Shaukat Aziz. Now, of course, when we're focused on emerging markets and BRICs and so on, so I know there's all stuff in here, but answer what you need to answer.
Yeah, just briefly, I think if you need more detail, you should talk to me separately. But on Pakistan is a country with tremendous potential, 180 million people. It has a very strategic location, and its biggest asset today is its human capital. That really is what is the driver for what has happened in Pakistan. Pakistan has shown that it can be one of the top, many people don't know this, it can be one of the top growing countries in Asia. For 8 years, we were in the top 4 or 5 growth countries in Asia. And when I say this to people, they look at me very bewildered, but this is in fact true. Having said that, we obviously have challenges. Our situation, the unique situation Pakistan is in, is take Afghanistan. The troubles in Afghanistan have had a very negative impact on Pakistan. Pakistan has paid a huge price for what is happening in Afghanistan. And I believe gradually, as peace returns to Afghanistan, the biggest peace dividend will come to Pakistan, in addition to Afghanistan itself, because of all the situation which is happening there. In terms of structural reform, Pakistan has come a long way, and the ingredients are there for growth. But if the obviously the security situation creates tremendous challenges, which is directly as a result of what is happening in Afghanistan. So I'm a great believer that if you solve Afghanistan's problem, it'll have a very good fallout on Pakistan. Apart from that, your comments on the economy in Pakistan and what we have done, I think you could look at Pakistan as in terms of reforms, structural reforms, better than most developing countries around. But it gets covered by all the other incidents which you refer to, other factors you refer to. So I'm a great believer in Pakistan. I think there's a lot of opportunity, but the challenges are also huge. And that's what we have to overcome. And I'm sure that in a democratic country, people will elect the governments which are needed to carry this forward and reach their objective. But the geopolitical situation has really created a negative effect in terms of reducing investment, reducing growth, reducing jobs, because of the environment which that creates in the country.
Thank you. I know His Excellency, by the way, Faisal, is open to you approaching on the other issues. I want to keep the relevance of this topic to the Association of Emerging Markets with this region as well. And Dr. Sabban, on that issue, Dr. Khalid also talked about the lack of opportunity that Saudi has had from its wealth base in terms of development.
Well, I am equally worried as Dr. Memani indicated. I think future generations deserve to have equal, if not better life than ours. And I think we have the financial capability, and I think we can diversify our economy. Of course, we've been talking about diversification for a long time, and we are still far behind. But I think we are, this time, very serious. I think Saudi Arabia could be an energy exporter. It is not only oil, but we can develop solar energy, we can develop all other forms of energy in order to be an energy exporter. In the mining area where we are embarking on exporting phosphate, among others, we are doing a lot in the downstream industries. And I think this is very promising in the longer term. Definitely, we need to better utilize our financial capability in order to arrive at a real diversification. But above all, we need to concentrate on education. Education, and I'm sure that the coming panel discussions will concentrate on education, is the key issue for the keeping sustainable economic growth for Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, sir. Before I get to a voting question, I want to get to the ladies section again. Thank you for your patience. It's hard to see who's got their hands up, so I appreciate the runners giving me indications. Microphone number 5. Thank you.
This is Mona Nomrosi from the Saudi media. I am wondering, that's the global economy prove its failure. Why we don't have our own economy with the Far East, like India and Pakistan, and we develop something like Africa. Africa is a wealthy continent, and her people suffering from starvation and dehydration. This is my question.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mona. Let me ask perhaps Professor Gupta to address this, why perhaps there's been this lack of shift from this part of the world to the East in terms of developing its connections.
Yeah. I think, I mean, if I look at the numbers, you know, for instance, I look at last year's numbers for Saudi Arabian exports, actually, if my numbers are correct, that more than half of Saudi Arabia's exports are to actually not just Asia, but emerging Asia. So that's not even counting Japan and South Korea. Just emerging Asia is taking more than half of Saudi Arabia's exports. So I think clearly the focus of Saudi Arabia, of this region, is towards Asia. But more broadly, you know, if I look at what's happening in Asia and also connect up with what Mr. Aziz was saying about Pakistan, is that Asia is an interesting region. You know, politically, it is probably the most challenged region in the world. You know, you have challenges between China and Korea, South Korea, China and Japan, China and India, China and Philippines, Pakistan and India, and so on. Despite that, actually, despite those serious political challenges, if you look at economic linkages, you know, between China and South Korea, China and Japan, China and India, It is phenomenal. You know, China-India trade last year, 2011, $75 billion. It's growing at about 25 to 30% a year. If it continues at this rate, you know, before 2020, China-India trade will be larger than China-US trade. And you know, the recent developments about Pakistan and India beginning to normalize the trade relationship, and it's already happening. So I think, you know, I'm quite optimistic that the economic linkages within Asia will continue to grow, and they will draw the GCC region, they will draw Saudi Arabia very much into that orbit.
Perhaps, Mr. Fernandez, your perspective on, do you see this shift? Are you sensing this kind of shift that Professor Gupta is talking about?
Oh, well, I see the relationship with China and Saudi Arabia is continuing to grow. There's a great demand, obviously, for commodities in China, not just from here, but from anywhere in the developing world. And I don't see that ending. I think the challenge for Saudi Arabia will be how do you turn that demand into something else downstream? How do you keep it from hollowing out your industry, which is something that other countries fear? But if you can take that demand and use that in order to promote and develop other sectors, I think it's a win-win.
Dr. Sabban, a very quick thought, sir.
Very briefly, I think with the sovereign funds that GCC and in particular Saudi Arabia is investing a lot in China, India, and other countries, and that I think will have good return. But besides that, I think Saudi Arabia has already concluded many joint venture projects with China, in particular, in the area of petrochemicals, in the area of refinery, etc. And I think that will enhance the cooperation and will get it closer, not only with China, but also with the other emerging economies that we are talking about.
Thank you.
The only other thing I would add to agreeing with everything is we must focus on free trade agreements between these countries. So one of the suggestions I would make is that we should go aggressively for FTAs with the countries mentioned. I won't repeat them. But that is one of the best integrator and best engine for growth if you get the right countries together.
As I said, yes.
And Saudi Arabia has a great opportunity to do that.
Definitely.
Can I check how many of you have the voting devices? If you just raise your hands if you have a voting device in front of you. Excellent. We have a good number here. We could bring up a question here we have, which we'd ask you to vote on, please. Let's see if we can get it up on the screen here. And all you have to do is press firmly the choice of button, the number on there, to get the vote in place. Let's see if we can get that question up. Do we have it? Perhaps we can get to it in just a moment as they get the vote. Oh, here we go. No, maybe it's not up yet. All right, while we get the vote ready, let me just take one more question here. We had, where was it? Sorry, I think this gentleman was first, so bear with me. Now, microphone number 2. All right, well, let's do the vote. Sorry, we got the vote up here. What level of debt to GDP ratio is acceptable for economies in the future? So if you could vote on this question, what level of debt to GDP ratio is acceptable for economies in the future? If you think it's under 25%, press A. If you think it's between 25 and 50%, press B. And if you think that more than 50% debt to GDP ratio is acceptable for economies in the future, press C. So A is under 25%, B is 25 to 50%, over 50% is C. Then once you've pressed that button, we should have it. If you change your mind, you just press the other one you want to vote on and the letter you want to choose, and it'll just automatically update it. So we should have a result in just a moment on this. What level of debt to GDP ratio is acceptable for economies in the future? So let's see if we have that. Here we go. So, okay. We have, it looks like the majority of you are saying that under 25%. So it's actually a balance between under 25% and 50%. Very few of you think that 50% is acceptable, over 50% is acceptable. Okay, we'll have another question for you in a moment. But let me get to microphone number 2 with our next question, please.
Sikandar Zaman, National Commercial Bank in Jeddah. I just wanted to ask, taking BRICs as an example of where some of the emerging markets probably want to get to, I would like to ask Mr. Aziz and Mr. Gupta what they think countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and African countries, and also some of the GCC countries here, if they were to pick one or two issues that need to be focused on to become like BRICs and be more successful like China and other countries, what should they be focusing on?
All right, perhaps Professor Gupta, I can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, actually, you know, if I look at the BRICs themselves, I sort of divide them into 2 by 2. So you have China and India, which are resource poor, Brazil and Russia, which are resource rich. And the interesting thing is that China and India have been growing faster than Russia and Brazil. And so to me, what that would say is that really it's unleashing entrepreneurship, you know, within the country. And it's that unleashing of entrepreneurship, it's the productivity, it's education, it's R&D. And so if I was to say, you know, simplify it a little bit, but not hopefully too much, is that the big lesson, you know, whether it's Bangladesh or Pakistan or other countries, would be the unleashing of entrepreneurship, a focus on infrastructure, a focus on education, focus on research and development.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Aziz?
Yeah, first of all, we should, with due respect to everybody, get this notion out of our minds that BRICs have something in common. BRICs was created by a bank, one of the economists in a bank, because it helped their marketing campaign, and the world has adopted that. There's really not much in common in BRICs except size. And in many areas they are good, in many areas they are not good. So I wouldn't use that as a model that you want to be BRICs. Bigger is not better. And as was pointed out earlier, South Korea and many other countries I could name who have better governance and better reforms than what BRICs have. Having said that, I would still go back to management. Deregulation, liberalization, privatization, good governance, that is the big differentiator today. If you have good management, transparency, rule of law, and the ability to do the right thing without too much interference, the markets will grow. You will attract investment. And openness of the economy, inflow of foreign capital, outflow of local capital, all these become drivers of growth if you do it right. If you do it wrong, you could be big, but you'll be very inefficient. So size is not the criteria. It's really governance, reform. Private sector in all these countries is good, but you got to create an environment to get the best out of the private sector. If you have too many regulations, without naming any country, you will find them looking at ways to go around the regulations. And a smart businessman would be defined as one who goes around the regulations. Doesn't really help in the long run. So governance is key, human capital and knowledge economy is key. If you have this criteria, capital will flow to you, local and foreign. If not, you can be as big as you want, nothing will come in.
Okay, microphone number 3, our guest waiting patiently. Thank you.
Yes. Well, it seems to me that there is a common language among the economists that the global economy faces many challenges. And the year 2011 turned out to be so badly. Prices are high, food security is at risk, commodity prices is very high, and protectionist measures seem to be here and there. And this is due mainly, in the words of Christine Lagarde, the managing director of the IMF, is due mainly to the lack of determination to reach cooperative solution. Now, this leads me to the question that, and I will speak my heart, does this mean that we do have to rethink the global organizations, i.e. the WTO, IMF, World Bank, and so on? Do we have to rethink their presence, i.e. do we at least rethink, restructure, or even re-engineer their policies and system? Thank you.
Interesting question, sir. Thank you. I'll put it to Mr. Fernandez first, if I may, on this idea that perhaps these organizations need reform, perhaps a little outdated. Your view, sir?
You know, they probably do, but I think, and maybe this is just the function of age, I think you've got to realize that if you look at what Europe has done, you know, these are very difficult issues that take time to work through, and these are difficult issues that basically will take time to work out. If you look at the last set of actions that the Europeans have done to deal with the Greek crisis, as you heard before, the issue of fiscal cooperation, collaboration, this is something that can't be done overnight. The Europeans, I would argue, have taken some very strong measures, have had to take some politically very divisive actions. And to me, that's not so much an issue of an organization. It's a question of how difficult these problems are and how difficult it is, in a sense, to make it up as you go along. I would argue the same thing with the WTO. The reason you have the impasse on Doha right now isn't so much the function of the organization, it's the function of a metaphysical discussion or an existential discussion between what is the role of the newly emerging markets and the developing economies. That kind of difference is not going to be solved by changing the organization. Yes, they do need change, and we've talked about how at the World Bank and at other multilateral organizations, there's got to be a rebalancing of the weight, of the relative weight of the emerging economies. But I do think I wouldn't confuse the structural issue with the fact that these are very difficult issues that will take time.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so quick comments, please. Dr. Sabban?
Very briefly, I think you are absolutely right. Some of these organizations need reforms. But as far as the WTO, I think the reason for the stalemate that we are facing is that we see the emerging economies are not being subject to arm twisting. They have more muscles now that you cannot twist their arms. And not only that, but also the developed countries are not realizing that the world is changing. And it is not like the IMF or the World Bank, where the majority of the votes is with developed countries. WTO is by consensus. And that is why we see Brazil, BRIC countries are going very strong against taking any decision that will not serve their interests. So I think we need to see how to accommodate the concern of not only emerging economies, but all other economies, and not to dictate some kind of decisions on other countries as it used to be in the past.
Quick thought, Shaukat, Aziz, please.
Yes. This is a very emotional issue for anybody coming from a developing country. Should these organizations be restructured or changed? The answer is yes. First of all, WTO, as the Honorable Assistant Secretary pointed out, the Doha round is stuck. The WTO is fast becoming increasingly a bureaucracy. And really, we talk about, everybody will stand here and say we believe in free trade. The fact is, the developing world has been taken for a bit of a ride. The developed world does not believe in free trade if it doesn't suit their interest. So we should say we believe in free trade if it meets the interest of the developed world. Okay, if that's what you want, you will never get a real effective WTO. So let's call a spade a spade. Secondly, IMF, World Bank, they have a major role. They constitute some very important, but they are clubs still. We have to restructure their boards, their voting patterns. They don't believe in meritocracy. Unless you have the right passport, you cannot be head of the IMF. If you don't have the right passport, you cannot be head of the World Bank. To me, that is fundamentally wrong. You should go for merit in these organizations. You should go for equity in these organizations. And till you achieve that, they do a great job. The people, the personalities are good. But you must have an open kimono and a flat, an open process where you get the best talent. They should say this position is open, come up with the candidates, and on merit it should be decided. So the world still, really, the WTO is becoming increasingly a nice bureaucracy facing the Lake of Geneva. That's not what it was designed for, because the Doha round is stuck, and we have gone from one session to the other. The developed world doesn't want free trade unless it makes them better. So we have to really do a lot more work. Time doesn't permit us to go into the details, but the question was very appropriate. These organizations, our WTO is working below par, not up to its potential, and the financial organizations, which have great people, don't get me wrong, but they are not as transparent, as open, as equitable as the world demands today and will demand much more tomorrow.
I know I have Mr. Fernandez wanting to respond to that, so perhaps please.
I hate to get into a public debate with a wonderful colleague, but I believe, certainly on the U.S. side, we very much believe in free trade. We very much believe, if you look at the American economy today, it is the freest place to import in the world. I think the issue, when you get to the specifics on WTO, is what will be the role and what will be the responsibilities of the large emerging economies. Will India be treated the same way as Bangladesh, to use that example? But I do not believe from the U.S. side, when you look at how easy it is to import and to do business in the U.S., it's one of the easiest places in the world that you can say that we don't believe in free trade. We wake up in the morning thinking of free trade.
I think, Professor, we have literally just half a minute for you to respond.
Very quickly, I think some things are very clear, some are not. The part which is clear is that today, 2/3 of the world GDP is still developed economy. So what happens in Europe does affect the rest of the world. 10, 15 years from now, things will look very different. At that time, a similar kind of a European problem would be a regional problem, not a global problem. What's not clear really is that as the BRIC economies, as the emerging economies become front and center, the center of the world economy, can they achieve consensus? And that's not so easy to figure out. That would Brazil, Russia, China, India agree, for instance, on who the candidate for the World Bank presidency or the IMF managing director position should be.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm going to just get this vote, second question in for you, if I may please. So get your remotes ready. We have this question that came for a vote question. It says, if developed countries stagnate, will BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, be able to continue growing? What's your view? If developed countries stagnate, could the BRIC countries continue to grow? A, yes. B, probably. C, doubtful. And D, definitely not. Press the button you think applies most. If developed countries stagnate, could the BRIC continue to grow? A, yes. B, probably. C, doubtful. D, definitely not. See what comes up. Hopefully we'll get a decision any moment now. Hopefully you finish pressing your buttons and we will see. Okay, well, 38% say yes, they could continue to grow. 29%, quite close there, say probably. 25% doubtful, 7% definitely not. So the strong sway, about 2/3, is in favor of them continuing to grow, even if developed countries stagnate. I thank you for your vote there. So, you know, someone told me a story about trade restriction, which I should just share with you. It's very, very brief before we end. And it's actually about, apparently there was a Pakistani man and his fiancée on Umrah. And while sitting there, a very rich merchant happened to be walking by. And he saw the fiancée and just spontaneously turned to the young Pakistani man and said, I will give you 100 camels for her. The man looked and he thought about it, he hesitated, then finally said, no, she is not for sale. After the merchant went, they did their salams and he left, the fiancée said to the husband, or to her man, why did you hesitate so much before answering? He said, well, I was trying to figure out how I could get 100 camels back to Karachi. So I gather his funeral took took place soon afterwards. That's trade restrictions. I apologize to those of you, including the ladies, who had questions and couldn't get them in time. Do remember the theme of this of today is continuous, so many of the questions you have and many of the points you want to raise will apply to the continuing panels. I ask you to take a very short break here before we continue the next, but a round of applause, please, for our panel there. Very short break, please, 15 minutes, and we'll start the second session.